Hello and welcome to INT1110. I'm your host, Daniel Schmeling, and today I'll be talking about some hardware and some differences between hardware and laptops, desktops, phones, and some of the components of the hardware. This will help you in discussion 1 and lesson 1 to grab some of these concepts in INT1110. But before I start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll go ahead and get moving. Sorry about that. So I work in the industry for IT. I have a master's degree in information technology. I've been in the field probably about 13 to 14 years now. Before that, I was in the Army. I am currently in a corporation. I manage 8 sites and approximately 15 to 20 um, personnel. We have about 1,000 users, and so I'm familiar with some of the concepts and aspects that I'll discuss. So I'm giving you that real-world experience. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into this lesson with regards to hardware and software. I wanted to show you a couple things first. If you'll join me on the screen, I wanted to first talk about this particular port right here. This is a VGA cable. This port is the most common for video graphics. You'll know that most of the cables now that go into a laptop, on the side of a laptop or into a desktop, have this type of display. It's called a VGA port. And what it does is it just sends a video signal from point A to point B. So say you are using your desktop and you want to connect to a display, you plug in the VGA cable. It'll be blue, and this is called the female side of the VGA because it does not have any pins. You'll connect the male side in, and you should get a signal, a video signal. So that's one of them. I'm not going to go over all the ports here. This is a DVI, called the DVI port. This again transmits a video signal from a source to a supporting source. So again, from your desktop to a monitor. It is more along the lines of on the desktop side. It's not really on the side of a laptop. So I have a laptop here. As you can see, I have that's a VGA port, right? So if I plugged in the cable to a monitor, I would get a video display. HDMI is becoming more and more of the norm. The difference with VGA and DVI to an HDMI is that an HDMI also carries sound, right? You do not need a separate cable to travel the sound. So for example, let's say you're using a TV as your display, right? If you plug in an HDMI and go from HDMI from the source to the destination, it carries the sound through as well. And again, these are coming to be, the norm on laptops. Not yet, but it is becoming more and more. DisplayPort is also carries video and sound. That is also becoming more and more of the norm. Some of them are making proprietary display ports. You may have a Dell display port or something of that sort, but display ports also carry video and audio to the destination that you want to go to. I'm not going to go over the Thunderbolt. This is a network, right? So instead of using wireless, you plug in a network cable that plugs into a wall jack that goes to a switch, and you get your network transmission. All these are just regular audio ports. These are USB ports. USB that has blue is called the USB 3.0. That carries a faster speed to transmitting data. These are the older PS2s, which one was a mouse, one was a keyboard. Those have been replaced with USB. Right nowadays, most USB mouse and USB cable or keyboard is the standard. But these are the older PS2 ports. This is called a serial port. It generally has 9 pins, and they're male. It will transmit from one device to another. So let's say you want to plug your laptop into a switch or a router. You use that serial cable. It causes that connection, and you're able to send some data to that device. Parallel port is the old ports for printers. Those are no longer used nowadays. Printers are again with a USB port or a different type of USB, maybe a USB-A or something like that. So let's go ahead and get to what's inside the case. This is important for your lesson, so I'm going to go ahead and blow it up. I want to first cover this whole device that this is sitting on. So this is in a desktop, right? And what everything sits on is a board, right? And that board is called the motherboard. And I want you to think of the motherboard just like a mom, right? A mom holds that family together, right? A motherboard holds all the components together, right? So you have this board that everything sits on. It has built-in ports, right? Some of the ports we just talked about, right? And the motherboard holds all those pieces together, right? It's a circuit board. It holds a whole bunch of information or a whole bunch of hardware. Some of that could be the RAM. This is a RAM right here. We're going to talk about RAM in just a moment. You have a fan here, and underneath that fan, right? This fan is usually called heat sink, and underneath that is the processor, right? Power cables that go to your power supply, right? This is the power supply, and all these cables come out of the power supply and plug in different things in order to give it power. These are generally the drives, right? And this is your disk drive or your hard drive. This is called basically a DIMM slot. So this is generally the motherboard and how that all works. So we'll go into some of those components in just a minute. Let's go ahead and so we talked about the ports, right? The different types of ports and what they do. You know some of those ports because we've talked about them. We won't talk about them all, but those are some of the ports that generally are on the motherboard. Now here you have memory modules or RAM. And I want to talk about RAM in just a minute. I want to talk about the differences in RAM so that you understand. Your RAM here fits into a slot, and this is a DIMM slot, and there's certain pins on that slot so that it fits, right? A desktop which has a bigger motherboard can support a bigger RAM, you know, with the pins and the slots. So a laptop has what's called a SODIMM. So that is not as big. It's a smaller slot because the motherboard is smaller on a laptop than it is a desktop. So generally, you'll have a smaller slot to fit the RAM in. RAM comes in different sizes. It depends on what the motherboard can support. So you can have a 2 gig, a 4 gig of RAM, 8 gigs of RAM, 16 gigs of RAM. But you can't just cram in as much RAM as you want, right? So I can't just say, oh, look here, there's 4 RAM slots. I'm going to put in 4 16 gigs of RAM, and I'm going to have, you know, 64 gigs of RAM for my desktop. It depends on what the motherboard supports. And also RAM slots have different sequences, right? So you see this is a black slot, this is a black slot, this is a blue slot, this is a blue slot. You might have to pair them. So you might have to go black and black first, then blue and blue, right? Because it may support different processors, right? So black slots, and this is more typical in servers than not. The black slot may support one processor, and the blue slots may support processor number 2. So you can't just cram a black and a blue and a black and a blue. It depends on what the specifications of that motherboard are, and it depends on what it can hold. So you have DIMM and SODIMM, right? DIMM again is for desktop. SODIMM would be for the laptop, and they're generally smaller. Okay, you have different types of hard drives, right? So this is the older version hard drive here. It has a platter. That platter spins on the inside. So we call that typically the kind of optical drive, or it's a mechanical drive that has spinning parts. This right here is an SSD drive. It's a solid state drive. It does not have any spinning platters or whatnot. it typically lasts longer. The solid state drives are faster, right? So you have the hard drive that is a spinning platter and a solid state drive and then a CD-ROM. So the purpose of the hard drive is to store data, right? We store our pictures here. When we save things to our computer, we're saving it on the hard drive. As to the purpose of RAM is to store programs in memory, right? I don't want you to get these two things confused, right? So typically when you run a program, you double click on a program, it's launching that program to run. It's launching it from the memory, right? Or from the RAM. Whereas if you save something such as a picture, a document or whatnot, you're saving it to your hard drive. Okay, you're just saving that for storage, right? So think about your mind, right? When you try to remember something, an event that happened, you're pulling it from your memory bank, so that you could recall it in more detail, right? So that's similar to RAM. When you're running a program that you've already RAM, it's pulling it from that memory, and then it's running that program, right? So when you have more RAM, your performance of running programs and more programs at once is typically better. So the other thing I want you to pull out of this, and I want to keep this short, 10 to 15 minutes, I don't want to get too in depth, is the form factors used, right? So motherboards have different form factors, right? And just think about the case and the size, right? A desktop is bigger, a laptop is smaller, so there's different factors or form factors for different desktops or for different laptops, right? Excuse me. You may have a very small desktop, right? And we call the motherboard that goes in there a small form factor. And basically it's because of those the motherboard that has to fit in that. So there's different types of form factors on motherboards, different sizes, shapes, or holes that are compatible with different towers or laptops. We're going to go ahead and close this conversation. You can certainly look at these PowerPoint slides that are presented in the textbook or in your lesson, and you can read to get more information. But generally, I just wanted to give you a head start to this lesson with some tips and some information. And so I hope that you liked it. This concludes the Lesson 1 lecture, and I'll see you next week for Lesson 2. Thanks.